Hello, and welcome back to Feybury here on the Arcane Forge. My name is Josh, illustrator, researcher, and voice behind the Arcane Forge, and in my videos I like to draw something that's fascinated me about D&D and research way too much about its origins and how you can use it in your games. With February being, well, if I'm honest, I'm just a fan of a portmanteau. So with February just existing and Fey also existing, the urge to merge those two words together to become Feybury was irresistible to me. I'm sorry, I will see myself out right after this video, but it raised a very good question of what are the Fey actually. We have like a really good understanding of some of the creatures in D&D, but the fairies are a bit more vague. So I wanted to cover like how they come about. What are the differences between little diminutive sprites and Archfey, and how do they all coexist? So I hope all of that will interest you as well. When I talk about Fey creatures, it's easy, certainly for players new to the game, to assume that I'm talking about fairies, pixies, sprites, and so on. Tiny, perhaps harmless, cute, delicate creatures that are at best a charming distraction from an adventure, or at worst, a cheeky sort of prankster who might disrupt our adventures with some delightful chaos. While this isn't 100% inaccurate, and the Fey can behave that way, it's definitely not the whole story. This attitude to the Fey is kind of like saying that all mammals are incredibly slow and lazy because the first mammalian species you've met was a sloth. Okay, that's a really weird example, but you get where I'm going with this. The Fey are as varied in personality and appearance as demons, devils, celestials, undead, or humanoids of all shapes and sizes. And in this video, I want to shed a bit more light on who and what they are and how they might behave or how they might look in your D&D campaigns. Fey creatures are those beings who originate on the plane of Feyre, otherwise known as the Fairylands, the Feywilds, among other names. A reality intrinsically linked to our own, where wild magic reigns supreme, and where the logic that we rely on here in the prime material plane ceases to function in expected ways, and a beautiful but unpredictable irrational logic replaces it. I'll be covering the Feywilds in some depth in another video, if you'd like to hear more about that in particular. But what you need to know, fundamentally, about the creatures who reside there, or those who invade our reality from their nonsensical home, are that they don't follow any of the fundamental physical laws or rules that we might expect in our own world. For example, in our world, a new human is brought into this world by two other older humans having a child together. But in the Feywilds, creatures may follow that logic, or, more likely than not, creatures simply begin to exist as a result of certain events, feelings, or acts occurring. The Feywilds are both a storybook dreamland, where the dreams of creatures on various planes manifest into reality, and also a land dominated by nature and its rampant overgrowth. Both have equal footing in having a hand in creating their denizens. Locations of natural beauty or power, like tranquil streams, majestic glades, harsh windswept mountaintops, ocean-carved cliff faces, or grave-like bogs, draw magical forces to them the more reverence, beauty, or life surrounds them, causing such natural creatures as dryads, nymphs, or naiads to spring into existence. Creatures hewn from the bark of trees who dwell there, or are comprised of the water of healing springs. Blights or other insects might take on human-like intelligence to express the wrath of nature, or the disgust that people feel towards them, becoming embodiments of how we perceive these environments. The playful make-believe, or dreams of children in our world, unbeknownst to any living in the prime material plane, might translate to pixies, boggles, or goblins of one kind or another, being conjured into existence. Someone feeling trapped in a body they do not belong to, and the dysphoria that surrounds that feeling might cause a doppelganger, or a changeling to manifest in the Feywild, a creature who embodies the need for outer change and the isolation of imposter syndrome, the rage someone might feel, or, specifically, the act of murder itself might cause a red cap to grow from the blood of a murdered victim, or perhaps as an echo of the vengeance that the victim wishes upon their killer. Just as many creatures are born of this realm because of the stories that we tell. Warnings to children not to get too close to the water's edge because a selkie or a kelpie or some other manner of water spirit may drag them to their watery grave is a very tactile and vicious image that remains in a child's mind for years. The story may have been told simply to avoid a child who has yet to learn how to swim drowning, but the fear that this warning holds over a child will manifest as a very real, very physical creature in the Feywilds. Creatures like hags, yeth hounds, blink dogs, and more are created through our beliefs and the stories we tell, or the ideas we believe, but cannot rationalize. Though the monster under your bed may not be real in our world, they may very well become manifested in the Feywilds, and if your imagination is strong enough, they might bleed through to our world to cause very real problems. The creatures of the Feywild are so broad in spectrum and diversity that they are hard to categorize, whereas each creature in our world may be of a specific species, or at worst, blended together or invented by some mad wizard or demigod. The Fey operate under no such guidelines, and beyond the varied categories that I've tried to demonstrate so far, there are just as many creatures who are completely individual. You might find an octopus with goat legs and a suit of armor having a drink in a tavern opposite a pack of dogs playing poker on the ceiling. Not because they belong to any particular circumstances, but simply because they were some person's unconscious dream, and they now have an individual place in the Feywild as fully formed sentient creatures. To them, this is no more unusual than it would be for us to encounter someone from a different town, or with a different hairstyle to the one that you wear from day to day. Hang on for a second. Just while I've got your attention, I wanted to take a second, and I will be as brief as I possibly can, to say a massive thank you to my patrons over on Patreon. For those of you who don't know, channels like myself, and probably most other content creators, rely on Patreon to make the content that we do. This probably won't be a shock, but I spend the equivalent time of a full-time job working purely on Arcane Forge stuff, whether it's illustrating everything, spending time researching and writing scripts, which might take days, editing all of the videos, and responding to as many of your comments as I possibly can. It takes up a while, basically. And while I absolutely love doing it, Myrtle has a hefty snack budget, and I want to make sure that the lights stay on here at the Arcane Forge. So if we were to meet in person and you'd not think twice about buying me a cup of coffee or a cup of tea or something like that, then I'd urge you to head over to Patreon and help me out for perhaps the price of a cup of coffee. Just like these particular patrons, who this month are Aldrin, Christian Palmer-Smith, AJ, Dominique Jolly, Sam Hickson, Dan Waterman, Tamerling, Steve Harrison, Max Copeland, Styrax, Ryan H., Colby Monroe, Darth Gaetana, Max Schluter, Peter Balfe, Alfie Wolf, Matt Lichtenwalner, Braxton Hudson, Cav Manick, Bartlegruff the Great, Daniel Williams, Nathan Stratton, Ethan Dibby, Amanda and Jake Westfall, The Smiling Sadist, John Foster, Yorick Beese, Nap in Camo, George Punton, Raptor Dio, Nicholas G. Silver, and Duck Quack. In addition to helping me to actually keep making these videos, they get a bunch of rewards, some of which include things like chatting with me one-to-one every single month, and a bunch of others, but I'll make sure to leave a link down below so you can find out for yourselves. But anyway, thank you for your support, and for those who are paying for this content to be made, and paying for those viewers who can't afford to pay for this content to be made. You are all legendary, so thank you so much. And let's get back to the topic at hand. Where were we? While a nonsensical dreamland sounds like utter chaos, there is still a hierarchy and laws imposed upon the wild peculiarities of the Feywilds. After all, bureaucrats, royalty, worshippers of deities, and organised people dream and tell stories as well. And so, fiefdoms, rulers, and monarchs are dreamed into existence. But while these law-imposing creatures might enforce their values, on the tumult of the Fey. Rather than being logical or sensible laws, these usually take the form of a ruler going mad with power, creating an oppressive, confusing, or generally Kafka-esque relationship between the law and the subject of those imposing those laws. Think of the TSA, but they might change the rules every 15 minutes, and could imprison you for life if you blink more than once per second, let's say, or if you don't dance on the spot every time you hear someone say the word albatross. The royalty, oligarchs, noble houses, rulers, however you want to describe them, of the Feywilds are creatures called Archfey. Noble, powerful, and ancient godlike beings who can control most of, if not all of the realm that they call home. While some of these creatures resemble Eladrin or elf-like spirits of immeasurable age and power, others are primordial essences who congealed into more solid form. While the Archfey can be any creatures you can imagine in your own world, I am rather partial to the Prince of Masks, for example, in my own homebrew world. D&D does have some canonical creatures who it calls Archfey to better provide illustrations of what these creatures might look like and how they might behave. Perhaps the most famous of all, due to the rhyme of the Frost Maiden adventure, is the Frost Maiden herself, Auril, the goddess of cold, frost, ice sprites, the queen of air and darkness, who appears in one of several forms. Either a beautiful and regal Elsa impersonator with blue skin, composed of pure ice and diamond, a crooked and hunched skeletal crone draped in tattered clothes with a barn owl's head supporting great ram horns, and perhaps others that we have yet to perceive. Baba Yaga, who I've had the great fortune to make a video about already, is considered an Archfey, the mother of hags, goddess of witchcraft, and supposedly the mother of Tasha, as in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. Hirsum, the Prince of Fools, resembles a satyr. Hirsum likes to present himself as a jester or a bumbling fool, but uses this aura to sow a near incomprehensible web of manipulation and intrigue. He's said to have curly dark hair and carries a fiddle and what he calls a horn of revelry, which could have multiple meanings, with him being a satyr. But let's just assume music is involved. Nephion or Niphion, the king of bats, appears as either a Nosferatu-like humanoid, almost completely blind and wrapped in cloaks of shadowy fabric, or more often than not a colossal bat-like humanoid whose obsidian fur resembles a night sky. Nitra Siota, a princess of shadow glass, is a 9-foot-tall, bold, elf-like woman whose body is comprised entirely of semi-transparent, jet-like glass, which is as iridescent as an oil slick. Her fingers and toes terminate in several incredibly long and brittle needles, and she's wrapped in royal finery and a cloak of pure shadow. Her eyes are said to be a flame of pure jade, and her voice sounds like a fusion of a beautiful song and the cracking of a frozen lake. Oberon, one of the better-known Archfey, often called the Green Man in our own world, is a paragon of nature and acts as the Lord of Beasts. He resembles in equal parts a masculine human or elf, while simultaneously embodying a great oak tree with green or dark brown bark, whose leaves sometimes form a veil and a beard of great length. He's less of a trickster and a manipulator than other Fey, relying instead on martial prowess and brutality that nature provides as a guide. Those who have heard of the Arthurian legend of the Green Knight will know Oberon well. Titania, the Summer Queen, is said to appear as an Eladrin woman with beautiful gossamer wings, golden skin and hair in shades of all the leaves of autumn. She is considered the most powerful of all Archfey by some, and therefore is often called the Fairy Queen. She controls light and heat, the flourishing of plants, and is known to be intrigued by mortals, often keeping them as pets, lovers, or jesters. She's not altogether kind or cruel, but has been known to start wildfires on a whim, immolating huge swaths of the Feywilds in her fury. There are many others, but I'm sure you can get the picture of the types of creatures I'm talking about here. Each of these creatures dominates or belongs to one of the Fey courts, a fiefdom or province of the Feywilds, with their own characteristics and properties associated with the heads of each of those houses. D&D borrows a lot from Scottish folklore, the idea of there being two main courts of fairies, which are called the Seelie and Unseelie courts. Seelie, a Scots and Middle English word meaning happy, lucky or blessed, and Unseelie means the opposite, misfortune, unholy or cursed. While this distinction may seem fairly cut and dry, it's not quite so clear in reality. But as an aside, I just wanted to say Seelie is the root origin of the adjective silly. So hopefully that should tell you a little bit more about how the Seelie Fey behave. It has connotations of happiness, healthy mischief, and nonsensical fun. But while the Unseelie court are definitely malicious, or at least disruptive by nature, counting among their number hags, yathhounds, quicklings, redcaps, and so on, the Seelie Fey aren't necessarily good either. Seelie Fey, both in Scottish folklore and in D&D, are just less evil, or more compassionate, let's say, but definitely still dangerous and treacherous. Satyrs, Coreds, Dryads, Nymphs, Pixies and more are all considered Seelie Fey. Interestingly though, unicorns, although categorised as celestial creatures in D&D, stray the line into being Seelie Fey creatures by some accounts as well. So while there isn't necessarily a good or a bad kind of Fey, or at least there isn't a good kind of Fey, Unseelie Fey are maybe the kind that are going to lure you into a deep dark forest and play tricks with your mind until you are desperate and begging for death, whereas at least the Seelie Fey might stop just before the death part and return you home. So yay for the Fey? So what are Fey creatures? It's hard to tell. And if you are a dungeon master, then I hope you will use this as an opportunity to make the Fey into whatever you want them to be. Ultimately, that's the aim of D&D in general, that there shouldn't be a right or a wrong way to play it, or a right or a wrong way to depict any of these creatures. They are simply tools for you to fit your own story around. But more so with the Fey than any other creatures, I feel, you have an opportunity to make something that really fits your story. If you feel that there would be an architect of someone's heroic quest, maybe not necessarily their struggles and strife, but they might act as someone's antagonist, you might call them Fey, and you might embody them in some capacity. I feel like a really great example of Fey creatures would be the god Loki, in particular the Marvel Cinematic Universe version of Loki, as someone who is perhaps sympathetic, very fallible, a beautiful trickster you can't help but empathise with, perhaps through some kind of magic on their end, but ultimately an enchanting but deadly character who might allow you to overlook their strength, not being as immediately imposing as, let's say, a colossal Balor or something of that nature, but still having every ounce of the level of power that more evidently potent creatures in the Monster Manual might have. I've tried to include a broad spectrum of creatures in my illustration today to show how varied these things can be. There's a touch of grandeur and elf-likeness, of insectoid carapaces, and of plants growing from all of these creatures to tie them together as something that's a visual language for the Fey, something that I like to include. In particular, I tend to describe most of my Fey creatures as something moth adjacent, but insects are a good way to go with the Fey. Fundamentally, the Fey doesn't care for you. It might be interested in you or fascinated by what you present, in the same way that a psychopath might not necessarily be someone who is going to harm you, but you serve a function for them, and they won't feel for you once that function has run out. You serve a purpose. And for the Fey, that might just be as entertainment. So be careful when venturing into the Feywilds and interacting with Fey folk. They are incredibly powerful. Treat them as you would demons and angels, and pay very, very close attention to what they say, because they are ultimately self-serving, or serving the nature of chaos itself. They are worth respecting, but perhaps not revering. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed today's video. I really loved researching the Fey and trying to come up with a bit more of a logical method for their existence. Hopefully it helps you manifest them in your games with a little bit more ease, and if that's the case, then I've done my job correctly. If you enjoyed today's video, please make sure to leave a little like down below, perhaps favourite this video so that you can refer back to it whenever you need it, and subscribe to the channel. I put out at least one video per week, with various live streams on top of that, and sometimes additional videos as well. And I would love if you could be here when I do that. We're still only tiny little pixies ourselves, hoping to grow into grand Archfey, but we can only do that with your help, so I would really appreciate it if you did, and anything you can do to spread the word really helps as well. But in the meantime, thank you so much for joining me, and until next week, happy monster hunting.